I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome back to Seamwork Radio, where we share practical ideas for building a creative process so you can sew with intention and joy. And today we're talking about how thinking about your handmade wardrobe as a garden can teach you more patience, resilience, and long-term thinking. So we're going to cover how both gardening and sewing can help you cultivate patience, joy, and the powerful experience of building something from scratch. All right, before we get into the topic, let's go to our icebreaker for today. Haley, if sewing were a sport, what would be your gold medal event?
This is a fun question. At first, I was going to say sewing swimwear because I really like sewing swimwear and it comes a little bit easily to me, but that's why it's not my answer. It's because I think in sports, I think it's something that you have to work at a little bit more.
Yeah.
Like a skill that you need to develop over time. And sewing swimwear, I don't know, by some miracle, it's just always been something I found quite easy. I would say that my gold medal would be in making it work, which is something that I've learned over time in my personal sewing, but also in my work as a designer. That's in order to be a good designer, you have to really learn how to be flexible, not in your vision, but in the execution of your vision and finding that happy medium between it's really knowing the brand and your style. In the case of sewing for yourself, knowing your own personal style and not letting that get in the way of good product.
Yeah.
There's this real balance between the two, and I'm really good at it. So that's my gold medal.
I think my gold medal event might be shopping for fabric.
Oh, I like that.
Not just fabric, but notions. I like shopping for notions a lot, and I think I'm pretty good at it. I have a pretty good collection of, especially vintage notions. I'm really good at finding vintage fabric and vintage notions and figuring out how to use them. So not just buying them, but actually using them and incorporating them into my sewing. I think I'm pretty good at that. So I think that would be my gold medal event, and I also enjoy it. So, and you're always good at the things that you enjoy.
Yeah.
In my opinion.
Or enjoy the things you're good at.
Yeah, that too. Well, if you have an icebreaker question for a future episode, you can leave it in a 5-star review for the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and we're going to use it in a future episode. So if you have a question for me and Haley, go ahead and leave it in your review, and you'll hear it on the podcast pretty soon. All right, let's get into our topic for today. So when you plant a garden, you don't expect to harvest tomatoes the next day, right? But we have such easy access to fast fashion these days that I think we assume that creating clothing from scratch is going to be as simple as buying it from a place like H&M. And if you begin to imagine your sewing like it was a garden, it can alleviate some of that self-imposed expectation and give yourself more grace and patience. So learn how to celebrate the joy you experience when you build something from scratch. And eventually you're going to be able to actually wear the fruits of your labor, which is really cool. So just to talk about gardening for a minute, do you grow a garden at home, Haley? I know you do. I've been to your house.
I do. I think I started my first container garden when I was around 22, something like that, just growing tomatoes and herbs and containers because I lived in apartments and had gardened on and off since then. And in 2020, during the pandemic, it was the first time that I was like, I'm going to go full hog and create a garden and buy books and do all the things and get really into it. And I've been doing one every year since, with the exception of last year because I had a baby in April. So I thought it was maybe unrealistic.
You had something else to raise.
I had something else to raise. Yeah. And I know you do too. You grow a garden as well.
I do. I have been gardening seriously for about 15 years because it's about when I moved to Portland, I started gardening. I didn't have any outdoor space before that. So I had plants inside and I had a little lemon tree in my apartment in
Oh, cute.
in Oakland. And I learned a little bit about plants, but I didn't know that much about gardening. And then when I moved to the Pacific Northwest, there's a great book on gardening called Growing Vegetables West of the Cascades. And that taught me so much about gardening in our climate. And I started with a little raised bed garden in our first house that we had here. And it's kind of grown ever since. And now I have a pretty big vegetable garden and a lot of flowers too, and have learned a lot about gardening over the years.
So tell me about something that your garden or gardening has taught you over that time.
Oh, so much. I see the garden as a metaphor for so many things in my life. I think the gardening can teach you so much, not just even if you're not a gardener, just thinking about the concept of a garden, different approaches to gardening can really just teach you a lot about different aspects of life and especially about building things over time. So I think the main thing that I take away when I think about the garden as a metaphor is not everything works. Some things don't work and you have to accept that. And some things work for a while and then they don't work after a while. And there's just constant change. And so learning to be okay with change and adapting to change over time is just a really important skill to have in life, but especially in creative life, I think.
I would say the same thing, that it's taught me that sometimes things don't work out. I think it was an easier lesson for me to accept in gardening because you're working with forces of nature. Mm-hmm. It feels so much bigger than you. So it's easier to accept when things aren't working because it doesn't feel like a reflection of your personal skill.
Yeah.
Like it does in sewing, because I sewed for so long before I gardened. And you think that's something that I would learn through sewing.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah. I know. And then it's also like, just because you really, really want something to work doesn't mean it will. I think is another lesson. So, for example, when I moved to my current house, I used to grow a ton of roses at my old house in Portland. And when I moved out to my current home, I brought all these roses I had in pots that I wanted. And I just loved roses. I had so many roses. And the first night I had them, the deer came out and decimated all of them. Because we didn't have deer in the city. We didn't have deer in Portland. So even though I love roses, is my favorite flower, I can still grow them, but it has to be behind a fence that they can't jump over. And just have to adapt and just have to go with it. Some things you can change, some things you can't change. And it's good to know the difference.
Well, that's a really good setback that you had to deal with. Are there any other setbacks you can think of and how you dealt with them?
I think another one that just comes to mind I guess it's related. It's really just, we have a lot of critters generally. And so just learning to kind of live with them. And we built like this huge deer fence, gigantic deer fence. We lined our beds with hardware cloth so they can't dig under. We put down buried rabbit fencing around the edge of the garden so the rabbits can't dig under. Animals still get in all the time. The rabbits still somehow find a way to dig through sometimes. The birds fly in and eat all my blueberries. Like nothing will ever be perfect. And that's just something that I think gardening teaches you is nothing will ever be perfect and that's okay. What about you? Have you had a lot of setbacks?
Pests, for sure. We had a mole 2 years ago that really just had a lot of fun. You know, squirrels have been my biggest setback in my current house. Their favorite thing to do is to take one single bite out of every like squash that I grow, summer squash, winter squash. They like to take one bite, just enough to like ruin it before it's ready for harvest. And then I'm like, I'd be willing to just sacrifice one single squash. I'll give it to you. Just don't take one bite out of every single one I have.
Oh, they are such jerks.
They're total jerks. They also were really into beheading my sunflowers.
Oh, yeah. I've had that happen. Raccoons, too. Well, I have one more pet, critter story, which is in Portland. I was growing tomatoes. I love growing tomatoes in the summer. And I had one that was like these really giant, juicy yellow tomatoes, like orangey yellow tomatoes. But every single time one of the tomatoes would become ripe. So I'd look at it and be like, oh, it's still a little green. I'll pick it tomorrow. I would come out and it would be gone. Every single day, like as soon as it became ripe, the raccoons would come out and steal the tomatoes. I figured it was raccoons because the tomato was just gone. It wasn't like eaten on the vine. It was just gone.
Yeah, they gotta bring it back home for their caprese salad.
Yeah. Raccoons are known for their caprese salad, so that's how I know it was a raccoon.
That's how you know.
They have hands, so they can steal and they can cut mozzarella. That's, or I guess you tear, it's burrata, you can tear it with your fingers.
They can do both.
They can do that too. Yeah.
Multiple preparation styles and everything. Yeah, I think that learning to deal with pests and, I've found like the ways to maybe reduce it over the years. And it's been like a lot of trial and error. I'll plant certain things together, like to deter them, and hang like tinsel to scare the birds away, all the different things. And again, you're dealing with forces of nature. Sometimes there's only so much you can do, which there's definitely a lesson in all of that, which we have, speaking of lessons, so many lessons to share with you today. Lots of metaphor this episode is ripe with. So let's get into the tips. So our first tip is that planning a garden is like planning your wardrobe. You might be successful if you just buy some seeds and plant a bunch of things at random, but chances are you're going to be a lot more successful with your garden if you take the time to learn what plants to put next to each other, what things are great companions, what seasons or times of year to plant them in. And with sowing, you could just start sowing totally random things, but you may not end up with something that you really love wearing. If you plan on the other side of all of this, if you plan your sewing and think about the skills that you want to learn or the styles that you'd like to wear, you're probably going to have a lot more success. So I like to think of my closet kind of like an ecosystem as well. There are colors and silhouettes that work together. And if you think of these things more holistically, you're going to come up with a wardrobe and with garments that you'll wear and wear together more frequently.
Yeah. Have you heard of chaos gardening?
Yeah, I've seen these videos where people like buy like a bag of like mixed bean soup and like shake the bag everywhere or just throw seed packets out on the ground.
Yeah. I think the closest I've come to that is buying wildflower mixes of seeds and planting them in my hell strip on the curb at my old house. That's about as close as I've come to it. But I guess that shows sometimes it is okay to just kind of go for it and do what you feel like doing. But you kind of have to know a little bit about gardening to know what's going to work and what might not work.
It's that saying that you'd have to know the rules in order to break them or learn the rules before you break them. I think it's kind of the same with gardening and with sewing your own clothing. And it's not to say that and some people's style is just like a chaos garden, and that's how they want to start and how they want to continue on. And it's the same with sewing. If you're okay with like a higher failure rate, then maybe that's like a technique or a system that's really great for you. But if you're a person who likes to have a more reliable outcome, I think that a little planning goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that's true. At least for me, I personally love to plan out what I'm going to make. I just end up with things that I'm happier with that way.
It's part of the fun.
It is. It's the most fun, I think. It's the most fun part is deciding what you're going to make, picking out your fabric, thinking about color. I love it with gardening and with sewing.
Totally.
All right, let's talk about preparation. So in gardening, you really need to consider and care for the materials that you have to work with. So this might mean preparing the beds, for example, tending the soil, picking the crops, really understanding your climate, making all those kind of preparatory steps. And sewing also requires this type of preparation. So in sewing, you have things like washing your fabric, cutting your patterns, gathering all your tools together, kind of preparing your space, all of those things. And I think sometimes we kind of overlook that aspect of sewing and we want to get right down to it. But if you set that foundation for yourself to make the process more effective and enjoyable and even just a calmer, nicer experience for yourself, then you're going to enjoy it a lot more. And you also have to think about, like, with gardening, you need to throw out old stuff. You need to throw out old seeds and just kind of get ready for the new season. And in the case of sewing, getting rid of what isn't working for you anymore can be really valuable. So that can be processes that you've used before. It can be tools. It can be fabric, or it can even be a style. There might be a style that you were really gravitated towards before that isn't really speaking to you anymore. And kind of going through a process of eliminating the old every year is sort of a natural part with gardening. It's something you sort of have to do every season. And we don't have that built in quite as much with sowing because sowing isn't quite as seasonal as gardening, depending on how you sow. So building that in for yourself can be really, really helpful. And just thinking about, is this still working for me? Is this something that is just taking up space, either emotionally, mentally, or physically? Or is it something that I want to reincorporate again? And it's kind of the same with both pursuits.
Yeah, I agree. Our next tip or lesson is in cultivating patience. So, gardening is a really slow and deliberate process. It involves nurturing plants and starting from seed in lots of cases. And sewing garments is kind of like doing the same thing, but for your wardrobe. If you think of your wardrobe as the garden and the garments as the individual plants in your garden. And gardening changes with the seasons, and so does sewing. There's going to be seasons in your life where you're going to spend your time planning and dreaming and designing. There's also going to be seasons for creating and doing. And there's also going to be seasons for rest and maybe not doing a whole lot, both in your garden and in your sewing. And embracing those kinds of seasonal changes and really leaning into them is obviously in gardening totally necessary. There's that cycle, like you were saying, that's totally built into it. But in sewing, I think learning to accept those seasons and lean into them can be a really powerful tool in your planning and your processes, and also in just keeping long-term momentum going.
Uh-huh.
And I think that there's a lot of satisfaction that can be found in planning ahead and then having the benefit of reaping all of those rewards once your garments are finally sewn. I think the thing to not lose sight of along the way is remembering to celebrate those small wins when you have these big, lofty goals in mind, whether that's like this beautiful blooming garden or this perfect wardrobe of handmade garments, remembering to celebrate the small wins along the way. And that can be something as small as a sprout emerging from the ground or sewing the perfect seam or like mastering the zipper fly, or it can be finishing the garment. Remembering to celebrate all of those small wins along the way is something that's going to keep you feeling really motivated over time.
Yeah, I love that idea of thinking about it like seeing the sprouts emerge, because I feel like, at least in gardening, I feel like that's such a celebratory moment when you see that beginning of it. And sometimes with sewing, we get so focused on the end product that we don't celebrate the process and watching the growth happen like that. So I think that's a really cool thing to keep in mind. And the next thing I want to talk about is something we already touched on, which is dealing with setbacks. So we talked about some of those setbacks in gardening, that you have to deal with pests, you have to deal with bad weather, you might have a failed crop, you might have diseases that you had never seen before, and you have to figure out like what to do about them and how to treat them. And in sewing, you have mistakes all the time, like cutting errors, or you might find you have a puckered seam here, or there's a fitting issue that you have to deal with. And I think there are two things to think about here. One is cultivating the skill of solving these problems. So this takes just experience and knowledge that you gain over time. And it's often through making mistakes like this. So as you make mistakes, you start to accumulate knowledge over time, and that helps you to solve future problems. But the other skill is in persevering when problems come up and really just learning to treat yourself kindly and to make friends with those mistakes rather than fighting them, because those are your best teachers. So there's the actual knowledge that you gain from the mistakes, and then there's also the skill of resilience, the skill of learning to be okay with mistakes and see them for what they are, which is an opportunity to learn.
I love that. And both of them really go like hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
All right, our next lesson is that skills grow over time. So just like gardeners learn what works through experience or from each season to each season, sewists grow their skills with each and every project that they make. So you wouldn't expect your first garden to be your best garden, nor would you expect your first project to be your best. So you can always expect for each season to yield like a better crop, each project to be an improvement from the last. I think this lesson in learning to give yourself a little bit more grace and to look forward to those improvements instead of dwelling on what wasn't right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so valuable in both pursuits. And then the final thing that we wanted to share is that gardens and wardrobes both, they're both places to express who you are. So gardens reflect personal style through things like plant choice, through layout, through design. And sewing really allows for unique expression in things like fabric and patterns and embellishments. There's tons of ways to express yourself through sewing as well. And I have Pinterest boards for inspiring garments, for fabric, for things I want to sew. I'm sure a lot of you guys do too. And I also have boards for garden ideas, for plants I like, for colors in the garden. And it feels very similar to me. But I think the thing that stands out to me is that neither of these happen overnight. And it's really a process of trial and error to discover what your personal style is in both of these things. So, for example, I love cottage gardens, and I really like that kind of beautiful, romantic, wild look. But I also like to have a productive garden with lots of veggies and herbs. And then there are certain colors and certain flowers that I'm particularly drawn to. So it's taken years of gardening to figure out how to combine all of these things in the space I have, in the climate I live in, all those external factors into something that feels right for me. And similarly, it takes years of sewing to discover what I feel best in. And both of those things evolve over time. So I think with sewing and with clothing, you kind of feel like if you have a decent handle on your personal style and what you like, that it's easy to just sew things that reflect that. And really, I think the truth is, and we discover this over time, is that it really does take a lot of trial and error and a lot of playing around to figure out what is actually right for you and what feels best for you. And I think that's the great thing about sewing is there's so much more room for play because you can make anything you want, basically. You're not hindered by what's in fashion at the moment or what's in the stores and how much it costs and all these other things. You can really make what you want to make. So I think just keep that in mind that it takes time and it's okay if it's not right away. Even if you do everything technically right, you can still have that need to just experiment and play around and figure out what feels right for you personally.
Yeah, it's not linear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we can get caught up in the small setbacks and lose track of the fact that over time you are making all of this great progress, whether that's in your skill set or in your personal style of and just knowledge in general, that we're looking at the big picture trajectory, not that it's a straight line to the destination.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm just going to recap what we talked about today. I hope some of these lessons kind of stick with you. I love the garden as a metaphor, and it's something I come back to again and again. So what I would like you guys to take away from this is that, number one, planning a garden is similar to planning your wardrobe. And you can do the chaos gardening method for your wardrobe, but sometimes really thinking about what you want to make and what's right for you can lead to better results. Number two is that preparation matters and that taking a little time to prepare all your materials and everything you need before you get down to business can be really, really helpful. Number three is cultivating patience and remembering that this is a slow process of building things over a long time span. Number four is dealing with setbacks and remembering those two skills when it comes to setbacks, which are the actual problem-solving skill and the ability to kind of emotionally deal with problems when they come up and still stay motivated. Number five is the need to grow skills over time and that it takes time and experience to really build up a solid skill set. And number six is that gardens and wardrobes are both places to express yourself and express who you are, and that doesn't have to happen overnight. It can take time and it can be something that evolves with you and with your life. All right. Well, I just wanted to give a shout out before we go to our community because we have some of the nicest and most helpful sewists that you can imagine in our private community. And our team, along with thousands of seam workers, are there to talk to you and to cheer you on while you sew. You can ask any question about sewing with absolutely no judgment, and you'll get some amazing answers. You can also share your finished projects, and you can create goals, and we can even email you reminders to keep you on track with your goals. So it's the perfect place to go if you need a quick boost of creative energy. And if you want to join our community, you can get 50% off by joining us at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And if you like this episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. And again, if you want to leave a question for me and Haley, you can leave it in your 5-star review, and we will use it as an icebreaker on a future episode. You can also follow us on YouTube at Seamwork Video. You can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork. And if you'd like to join Seamwork and become part of our private community that I mentioned, plus get access to hundreds of sewing patterns and dozens of classes, our podcast listeners get a 50% off lifetime discount when you join at seamwork.com/go/podcast50. So that's seamwork.com/go/podcast50. And that is it for us this week. I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork, or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.